Okay, we're all set up with not just one, but two overflow rooms, and I want to say this is also being live streamed on Princeton Media, and for those of you who follow on Twitter, there's a hashtag called Snowden Live, and we're going to be taking some questions from Twitter later on, so those of you following on Twitter can send us questions there. Welcome to our event today. I'm Kim Shepley, Director of the Program in Law and Public Affairs here at Princeton. And I want to welcome you on behalf of LAPA, as well as the Center for Information Technology and Policy, as well as the Woodrow Wilson School, who are all co-sponsors of the event. It's unusual for the law program at Princeton to feature as a speaker someone against whom the US government has filed criminal charges. But the very size of this audience today indicates that Edward Snowden has done something very important by disclosing information that has alerted the public to what was being done in our name. And today we will explore what happens now that we know. Today's events are part of a series organized at Princeton this academic year that brought to campus Mike Rogers, who's the commander of US Cybercom, as well as the director of the NSA, and it also brought to us George Ellard, Inspector General of the NSA. Today we hear from the person who revealed what NSA was doing and actually gave them much bigger audiences than they might have otherwise gotten when they came. Edward Snowden is a former contractor for the National Security Agency who disclosed the many programs that the agency was running in order to, in the words of one of the agency's own slides, collect it all, process it all, exploit it all, partner it all, sniff it all, and ultimately know it all. Snowden worked in the intelligence community for 8 years, first in the CIA, including in overseas postings, and then through contract work at the NSA. Through the disclosures he made, we now know that the NSA and its partner agencies around the world have infiltrated virtually every form of electronic communication. They've gathered and stored a large fraction of these digital traces, and they've also weakened the internet itself by exploiting vulnerabilities and attacking encryption standards. In June 2013, Edward Snowden was charged by the US Department of Justice with violating the Espionage Act and stealing government property. When the US canceled his passport as he was traveling to seek asylum, he was left stranded in Russia, where he was making plane connections at the time, unable to travel further. He has since been given temporary asylum there, which is why he comes to us today from Moscow. Bart Gellman is going to interview Edward Snowden today, and Bart is a familiar face around Princeton. He teaches here in the Woodrow Wilson School. He's also a senior lecturer at the Century Foundation. He's a summa graduate of Princeton and a former Rhodes Scholar, and he was one of the journalists to whom Snowden gave the NSA documents. He's been reporting on the contents of those documents since for the Washington Post. Gellman was a co-recipient with Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, the other journalists to whom Snowden gave the NSA files. They were co-recipients of the 2013 George Polk Award, which they dedicated to Snowden. The NSA reporting by these journalists also earned The Guardian and the Washington Post the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Before his work on the Snowden documents, Gellman won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting for a series on Vice President Cheney, which turned into the prize-winning book Angler. He's a member of the team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting for his coverage of the 9/11 attacks. I think this is the first time that we've actually had one of the journalists to whom the documents were disclosed interview the person who disclosed them. And so now we have Bart Gellman, who will interview his source, Edward Snowden.
Thank you, Kim. Ed, one thing you probably don't know is that your head is about 6 feet tall and 40 feet off the ground. You're basically the Wizard of Oz. Try not to scare anybody.
Somehow I ended up becoming Big Brother.
Full screen. All right, so a brief preamble for you and everyone. Princeton has designed this as a forward-looking conference, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time asking the legitimate questions about the ethics of leaking or whether too much or too little was published. The subject is, we've learned a lot that we didn't know about NSA surveillance, and what, if anything, should we and can we do about it? How are we doing here? All right, we're playing with the screen here. And while we do that, I'll just say there's a small lag on this link, I think, and so if I wave my arms and shoot up a flare to interrupt, I don't mean to be rude. So here's first question. One of the hot new items now that we're talking about is strong cryptography. Ostensibly, it's about iPhones that are locked by Apple, but it's much bigger than that. It's the idea that companies are selling consumer technology with locks built in that are deliberately designed so that the companies themselves, even under court order, can't open them. And a lot of people who are not in the tech world say, why is that a good idea? There are actual bad guys in the world. Phones have a lot of evidence on them. Why do we want to make an unbreakable lock against law enforcement?
So I guess the first question I should ask is, can you hear me?
All right, let's see if I can make this a little louder. Is this the one that does it? Hang on, we're working on that. Would be great if we could hear you.
Let's try one more time. Can you hear me now?
That's good.
Good, the NSA.
Leave it to the... Yeah.
Okay, so when we talk about encryption, and basically what the government is really concerned about is not the existence of strong encryption. Strong encryption has existed for decades. It's existed around the world. This is not a new science. This is not a new application. What they're really concerned about is the fact that it is increasingly getting into the hands of average citizens. And they've become accustomed in sort of the post-September 11th period to being able to see everything we're doing. I mean, it's not a secret that the Bush administration began a program of warrantless wiretapping, which was not only unconstitutional, but not even authorized by a statute at the time. That program, which actually you published the Inspector General's report about, called Stellar Wind, began mass surveillance domestically in the United States. When it was revealed, there was controversy, and it kind of got some pushback, but it actually wasn't ended. In fact, it was sort of institutionalized, put under a new coat of secrecy paint, and we didn't find out how it had changed for many years moving forward. Now, in that intervening period, people like me who were sitting at the National Security Agency or elsewhere in the intelligence community, they really got accustomed to this new authority, which had been sort of granted to themselves in secret. When it was initially passed, again, it came just by fiat from the president. It was reviewed by a secret court, no open court, a court that in 34 years, out of 34,000 times, I think 35,000 times now, has only said no 12 times. So they sort of rubber stamped along with everything else. And it began to become part of the culture, the fabric, that when you have a question about what someone is doing, you can simply look it up in the database and it's there. All you have to do is be able to justify the search. Now, of course, justification isn't difficult for people who do this for a living. Now, this is what's changed. Culturally, the government has adopted sort of a worldview that if it is out there, we should know it and we should have access to it. But this is radically different from historically sort of the relationship between the government and the people that it governs, particularly in this country. When we sent mail envelopes across the country, we didn't send them in clear envelopes. They were opaque for a reason. We expect the government not to ask us why we need a right. That's not really how rights work. They have to be able to justify the intrusion into that right. And so with encryption, what we're beginning to see is a technological enforcement of historical liberties, things that we've always had, but now we can enforce in a more muscular way than simply letters on the page, on a piece of legislation somewhere. And this is, I think, fundamentally threatening and concerning to the government for reasons that are both legitimate and less legitimate. There are, legitimate needs for investigatory powers by law enforcement agencies, by intelligence agencies, as they go about their work. But it's really about scale, it's about scope, it's about ease of access. There's a reason that we put locks on our doors in our house. There's a reason that we don't allow police to go in warrantlessly and search through all of our homes of everybody in a city, even though it would surely give them an advantage in law enforcement. Surely they would discover evidence of crimes.
Right. So Ed, let me interrupt for 1 second and follow up. let's give the other side its due. I'm pretty sure that if Jim Comey or Admiral Rogers were here from the FBI, NSA, that they would say the analogy isn't to the fact that envelopes were sent around closed. The analogy is to an envelope that they can't open even if a court provides a legitimate order to do so. We've never had a safe, they say, that they couldn't eventually open if they had legal authority to do so, and that's what they're objecting to.
But that's actually not true, because we've had that for as long as humanity's been around. That's called memory. This is the reason that you also have the Fifth Amendment, which protects us from basically self-incrimination. It's this sort of technology that's being used to protect all of our communications around the world, not just against sort of domestic law enforcement agencies and things like that, where there are reasonable questions about how much access we want them to have, how we want to change that line, but also against very serious adversaries. And the problem with encryption, with the science, is there is no safe way to provide a backdoor for one party, but not another. If you weaken a system so that you can basically put a master key into it, you build a backdoor into a safe, as soon as anyone understands the principle of how to unlock that backdoor, how to let themselves in, those safes can now be opened not just by the FBI, but by Chinese intelligence, by Russian intelligence, by every two-bit tin pot dictator around the world, and even parties within our own country who may be criminal or politically motivated, ideologically motivated, to abuse those authorities that we've built in via legislation. And the problem here is, it's very difficult as a matter of sort of the technology to foresee when these breaches are going to occur, and once they do occur, to mitigate them. Because of the nature of
let me come back for a second.
Go
I want
ahead.
to come back to the security challenge. Could you do this securely? Just talk a little bit more about principle. So there are hundreds of millions of iPhones, and Google handsets offer at least the option, although not the default, of doing a similar kind of unbreakable encryption. So we're not talking about a small number of people who are going to be able to master an obscure technology.
Right.
I mean, it must be true that this is going to stop law enforcement and intelligence from obtaining some information that we might say as a society they should be able to obtain, right? So, I mean, that's the purpose of the strong locks, so that they can't be broken.
But this argument can be made about any technology. I mean, whether it's a hammer in a shop that's intended to build a house being used to kill someone, you don't hold the hammer manufacturers liable. You don't make them change the designs of hammers because they can be subverted to another use. The challenges when you face this kind of thing are, this cryptography is the underpinning of all security for everything online, and when you weaken it, it's not good for anyone. And when we talk about the fact that this is something that the internet relies upon, trade relies upon, the economy relies upon it, especially so in this country, we rely more on e-commerce than any other country around the world when we talk about gross numbers. And yet we are sort of militarizing these capabilities of attack at the same time that we are weakening the capabilities of defense. And this is really short-sighted policy. It might help, yes, the FBI in some edge cases, but really whenever we talk about the expansion of authority, whether this is state or federal or in any country around the world, legitimate expansions of authority, authority is only ever applied when it is absolutely necessary, when it is the least intrusive means of gaining the information required for the legitimate purpose, and it's proportionate to the threat faced. Now, what they're doing by basically trying to ban encryption on a commercially available level or mandate the inclusion of backdoors that mean encryption really isn't encryption anymore and it's unreliable is sorry, I've lost myself there.
Well, let me follow up then on something you said earlier, which was the security issue.
Well, wait, I apologize.
Oh,
actually,
you got it.
I caught up where I was going. When we talk about basically banning these things, is it really a need? Now, when we look at the actual statistics from law enforcement, from the FBI itself, from the DOJ, we see that in basically 2013, where encryption is massive, it's all around the internet. You literally cannot buy something online in most cases without that communication being encrypted, it was only seen to have any relevance to law enforcement investigation at all 27 times. And of those cases, in only 9 times did they not gain the particular piece of evidence they thought they might find from that. And I don't believe in any cases did it actually change the outcome of that case. So is it really necessary? And when we think about the types of things that are encrypted, for example, on a phone, typically you're talking about SMS repositories, you're talking about photographs, notes to yourself, audio things you might record on the phone. Nowadays, most of these things are also stored in the cloud service that's enabled by the company. For example, Apple has the iCloud. It may be encrypted on your phone itself, but it is uploaded to the company in a way that they can provide it in response to a warrant, in many cases by default, where it's available there. But even if it's not, the things that are actually truly relevant from an intelligence perspective, particularly when metadata is often more important than content, that is to say the fact that a communication occurred, the time a call was made, who it was made to, how long it was for, the kind of associations you can derive from this kind of information, as opposed to what was said on the call. These things are not protected by encryption. You can get a copy of everybody's SMSs that are sent back and forth from the phone service providers themselves, not Apple, but from AT&T or Verizon or Sprint. And so
unless Ed, they're using one of the something like 100 new secure messaging apps. We have the CEO of one of them, Telegram, here in the room, that are designed to prevent interception. So I mean,
but in those cases, when we're talking specifically about encrypted messaging services, this does not stop the intelligence community. Again, this is what I did professionally. This is something that happens every day of the week, even on Sundays at the National Security Agency. You can gain the content of encrypted communications off of encrypted devices based on a very simple principle, which is encryption that can never be decrypted is useless, right? Because you as the individual, you as the owner of that information, if it were encrypted basically even against you and you were looking at your photograph, it would look like white noise. It would look like static. It wouldn't be distinguishable from random information. In order for you to access that information, you have to be able to decrypt that information yourself, which means sort of how it's implemented is on the device, the key to the encryption. You can think of encryption basically as a math problem, and your password is the solution to it. The solution being, actually, it's one of the variables used in solving the problem where it returns basically your images, your SMSs, whatever it was that was encrypted on the device. Now, if you hack that phone, which is a very standard thing, it's quite easy to do. It's done, again, even by very non-sophisticated countries and governments around the world. You can then steal that key while it's in memory. But even if you can't do that, let's assume that devices are completely secure, not just against law enforcement, but against criminals, against everybody like that. Apple releases their next version of the iPhone. There are no backdoors. It's completely robust security. That device itself also cannot be broken into, so the key cannot be stolen sort of while it's in use. We have a case recently, the Silk Road case, which was about an online drug market. The individual who was convicted in the case quite recently was named Ross Ulbricht. He was a gentleman in Texas, I believe. And how did they compromise this? Now, the drug market itself was protected by robust, redundant layers of encryption for the communications going online. They were rerouted, so no one was supposed to understand who was involved in it, who ran it, and yet they discovered this. And when they identified the individual, they found out that he used means of encryption that have since been reported. The NSA cannot break them. They're not backdoored, they are secured. And he's one of these individuals using sort of these advanced methods, GPG and so forth. Despite this, when it came to the time of the trial in court, they were reading his diary entries that had been encrypted to everyone in the courtroom. Now, how did that occur? The fact of the matter is, when law enforcement needs to gain access to something badly enough, they come up with a means. Sources and methods of investigation are constantly being invented. They're being developed in response to these new changes in technology, these new changes in the way people interact with their devices and their private lives. In this particular case, This guy was going to public libraries, so he wasn't communicating from his own home internet address. He would then open his encrypted laptop. He would decrypt it. He would begin working on it and administering sort of his drug market. What the FBI did, which was actually quite clever if you think about it, was they staged, as a pretext, a domestic dispute within the library that distracted his attention to one direction. And as he looks over to the left, an agent moves over to the right and pulls his unencrypted laptop away and basically enters it into the evidence.
Right. His whole job in that case was to make sure the lid was not closed, so that the encryption wouldn't turn.
I believe there was actually an agent who was moving their finger on the touchpad continuously to make sure the screen didn't lock and everything like that.
Right.
But it's this thing, you know, we talk about.
Right. So,
well, we don't actually.
So
talk
I mean,
about
so what
officials in the FBI, they assert we're going dark. They assume that they're going to get shut out. It's going to stop investigations. But we see in case after case that not only is that not the fact, not only is that not really the reality of our world, but government and law enforcement agencies in general around the world have more investigative power and capacity today than they have at any point in human history. Why are they asking for more powers? Why are they asking to curtail our ability to access defensive technology when they're at the historical height, the high watermark of their capability?
All right, so there's a lot of nuance to this, and so I'll ask you to keep your answers a little short so we can cover more, but I do want to follow up quickly on this subject. One thing, I don't love arguments that say, it's a bad idea in principle to give them this, and anyway it costs us nothing, because they don't need it anyway. There have got to be cases in which
right, of course. It's not that there's no
they get locked up.
Theoretical case. It's that we're talking about edge cases, right? We have actual statistics on this.
So is this like, I mean, what I wanted to ask, is this like, in your mind, the idea that presumption of innocence or exclusionary rule will let some guilty people go, and that's the price we pay?
Well, that's really sort of the idea that our justice system was originally founded on. You know, it was the idea that it's better for 10 guilty to go free than for an innocent man to be wrongly convicted. Now, maybe that has been changed, but that's certainly not a decision that should be made by a few FBI officials behind closed doors of the National Security Agency. That's something that should be made by the people broadly, and it should be a consensus decision, not something that's really pushed through an abusive process or under emergency provisions, with the justification that's really no stronger than but terrorism. You know, it really has to be a meaningful necessity in order to change, sort of reshape the boundaries of our rights within a society.
Okay, so now we have in this room, you know, some of the world's best experts on technology and legal and policy experts, but we also have a general audience. So I'm going to ask you to respond to something that Admiral Rogers said here at Princeton in as kind of clear and simple a way as you can. He said the answer to this problem is that there should be, you know, a thing called a split key. So you have one key to open your iPhone or your laptop, and there's another one that exists, but nobody holds it. There could be 2 or 3 or 4 key holders. So maybe you need, you know, a Justice Department official to approve an FBI request after getting a court order from one or another kind of court, and then they present that to APA, which also has to give a writ piece. They combine all 4 pieces of the key. They've opened your phone. What's wrong with that?
Well, so the first thing is the simple principle that we're providing a backdoor capability into encrypted communications. Once we do this, once we say it's legitimate for a government to entitle itself to the communications of any individual, no matter how much they want to protect this information as a part of their private life, their private records, the government's entitling itself to this authority. Now, if the United States government does this, and it compels commercial service providers to enable this by mandate, the Chinese government will immediately mandate the same. And of course, these companies must be able to sell in China in order to compete in a globalized economy. They will do so, and then what have we done for sort of human rights, for basic liberties worldwide, when we are basically empowering some of the worst actors on earth, particularly in the case where it's never been shown to really be necessary. And beyond this, we're enabling competitors who do not compromise the security of their devices. Instead, what we're going to see is we're going to see significant companies, anybody who makes a meaningful product that has meaningful security guarantees, relocate. They're going to reincorporate under different jurisdictions that are a little more rights friendly, And then people are going to be buying Korean phones or Swiss phones or Swedish phones as opposed to American phones, because American phones cannot be trusted. No one's going to buy a product that has basically the security compromise by default when there are alternatives out there on the market. But even if that were not the case, and even if this very foreseeable problem in terms of enabling bad actors and sort of commercial consequence that we are paying for were not the case, backdoors have never been shown to be implemented reliably over time in a manner that's only accessible to a single party by anyone, much less a more complicated design with multiple keys, which represent multiple vectors of attack distributed across multiple parties. That's much more complex. In fact, we've got a number of researchers, such as Matt Blaze. I'm not sure which university he's affiliated with.
University of Pennsylvania. He's here, I think.
There we go. Okay. Is that the NSA already made this argument, as did the FBI in the 90s. They tried to talk about key escrow. They tried to talk about split keys. They tried to talk about basically redundantly encrypting things through what was called a leaf, a law enforcement access field within the communications that we send back and forth online, where they go, all right, this will be protected against most people, but it'll have sort of secret access field for the people we want to let in. The problem was that it was not secure, and the problem is that when they asked Congress for this authority, Congress said no. Congress said, we don't want to do this. We have, we have a Fourth Amendment for a reason in this country. We have a right to privacy. And yet, despite this, in secret, we realized that the NSA did precisely that. They began undermining, in secret, protocols, encryption protocols, to have backdoors that would allow them to surveil what was being sent back and forth. RSA had a protocol called dual EC DRBG, I believe. And this was actually independently discovered by researchers, the backdoor within it. Before
right. So just let me clarify that just a little bit. There was an algorithm, a way of encrypting information that the NSA helped influence when the standard was written, and we've since learned that they helped influence it in a way that enabled them to break it.
Right, and they actually paid the company for their collaboration.
So this actually raises one of the questions I wanted to get to, which is that NSA, not everybody realizes, has a dual role. It has a great big chunk of it is called information assurance. That's supposed to protect the integrity and the security of digital information. And then they have the Signals Intelligence Directorate, which is supposed to break everybody else's codes. And it's inherently a tough mission to accomplish it, doing both. Is it clear to you that NSA gave too much emphasis to the breaking part?
I don't think this is even really a point of controversy anymore. Initially there were some people who pushed back a little bit, but traditionally, the NSA was quite good, I think, at protecting our communications of our government and military agencies and whatnot throughout the past. They devised some of the encryption standards that are still used for top secret communications today, things called like Suite B cryptography. But in the wake of 9/11, the rules really changed. When you have individuals like Dick Cheney who are really dictating policy outside the meaningful review of any courts or legislature in that context, agencies see that there's a lot more money to be had, a lot more career to be made on the back of offense, on the back of being able to cite where you got information, where you gained access to something that previously wasn't available, than there was to say, we basically stopped these speculative threats. Nobody will be able to break into this, nobody will be able to break into that. They go, that's great, but we can't really quantify that because we don't know the harms that were mitigated there. So what happened was the attackers gained more clout, they gained more reputation, they gained more influence over time.
People respond to bureaucratic incentives.
Right, exactly, within the intelligence community. Now, the problem is there's always going to be some tension there. But where traditionally we've had a national security agency, now we have a national surveillance agency. And that's not good for anybody, even ourselves. Again, we have more to lose from getting hacked than we do to gain from hacking others. We spend more on research and development costs than any other nation. So why are we exposing ourselves? Why do we have the attackers deciding what holes to close? It would be much wiser, particularly because experts in the community agree that offense is much easier than defense in the modern context, to put the defensive elements, elevate them to be in the position where they say, look, we need to prioritize defense. We need to make sure we have the real strength here. We're closing more holes than we're leaving open. And basically, we're increasing the level of security that our society enjoys over time because we're the king of the hill. So there's pushing people down isn't as important as staying up on top.
So there's NSA, round numbers, 30,000 people, $10 billion annual budget. Some people say, well, just break it in half. You'll have Information Assurance Agency, the NSA doing the signals intelligence. You basically have one big agency trying to build better locks and one big agency trying to break them. Does that make sense?
It actually does. I think this was actually debated at a very high policy level. It was decided against, I believe, although this is speculation, largely for political reasons. They didn't want to be seen as changing the nature of the NSA in the wake of a scandal caused by the NSA. The resulting argument that was basically publicly put forth was that they synergize. Offense improves from the knowledge of defense, defense improves from the knowledge of offense, but there's no reason that that shouldn't basically be separated and you keep the lines of communication open. There's really not a great argument for saying we need to keep defense within an agency that we have a clear established record has subordinated the defensive interest that is more important to society broadly for institutional benefits.
So there were a lot of things in the disclosures you made, a lot of different programs. They're complicated. It's a big agency. It's a big world of surveillance. Let me try to walk through a few of them one at a time and give them a little attention. One of them is in the news now because Section 215 of the Patriot Act is due to sunset, to expire on June 1st, unless Congress does something to renew or to change it. 215 is the legal authority that NSA used. It's the authority to secretly obtain business records that are relevant to an investigation. NSA secretly used them for years, and no one knew until you disclosed it. To obtain the calling records of substantially everybody in the country. Not foreigners, not people talking to foreigners, not suspects, but everyone. And not the content of the calls, what they collected was who called whom and when and how long they talked, basically.
Right.
Congress has to decide whether to renew that. Where do you come down on that?
So what's interesting about this is that none of the agencies, including the NSA and even the FBI in many cases, have not really strongly fought in defense of 215. They've never said that it was vital in the case of a single identified investigation. Two review boards appointed by the President, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and the President's Review Group on Information and Communications Technology, who both had comprehensive access to classified information. They were allowed to walk in the NSA and interview everybody, including the director. They came to the conclusion that 215 had in fact never made a concrete difference in any terrorism investigation in the United States. So there's a real argument to be made. Do we need this? Is there any reason why it should not sunset? And there really hasn't been any persuasive decision made or persuasive argument made publicly. Now, what has been made was sort of a rhetorical argument regularly, which was, well, this could provide some value theoretically that would help in basically identifying certain kinds of terrorist attacks that involve phone calls made over the United States. Yet we've got a 10-year history in front of us that shows that that's not the case, despite the fact that we have had internationally linked terrorism events.
Well, let me put the argument as sort of the best I've heard it from them. The argument is that you need what you call mass surveillance and what they prefer to call bulk collection.
Euphemisms.
You need to have the whole data set in order to find unknown plots or unknown conspirators. That if you can only if you can only surveil someone by targeting them in advance, you only get to spy on the people who you already know about, and the people you don't know about are the ones you worry about most.
Right, that's called pre-criminal investigation, and that's never been a standard in any liberal democracy. What they're saying is that we want to be able to monitor people who are not suspected of any wrongdoing, of any individual crime, or we have any reason to suspect them of anything at all, because we might be able to identify somebody who is involved in crime. That is really no different than saying we want to be able to search people's houses, even though we don't think they're doing anything wrong, because they might have drugs in them. Now, they're not wrong that it would give them an investigative advantage, but that's not the way that liberal societies work. We don't make things easy for law enforcement agencies because it gives them an efficiency advantage. We make things difficult for them because we only want coercive force to be applied in scenarios where it's absolutely necessary and vital to the public interest that it occur.
So
technology has changed it so that surveillance is so cheap now, they can do it to everyone. Whereas in the past, they would have to assign a private eye or detective to follow people around. That's really the only thing that's changed there.
Well, so I personally think that's a very strong argument in the criminal justice arena, and someone might
intelligence gathering context.
Right, but somebody might accuse you of conflating intelligence and criminal justice. It's never been the standard for intelligence gathering. We don't say there has to be probable cause to believe someone's committed a crime for them to be a legitimate target of intelligence for national security or foreign intelligence purposes, right?
But that's not quite right. We do require, and we always have required, some reasonable, articulable suspicion, something larger than sort of gut feeling, that this building that we're saying we must monitor is actually working to the benefit of a foreign government. We have to say, it's an embassy, it's controlled by an organization that we know is associated with this. We don't simply go, well, they look like they might be Chinese, so we're going to monitor that building. That's not the kind of standard that, again, liberal societies found their application of powers upon. That is how it works in many authoritarian states. But the question is, do we want to be encouraging a slide more toward the authoritarian axis, or should we be championing a progressive expansion of the domain of liberty that people in free societies enjoy?
So let's talk about expanding the domain of liberty. In the United States, for surveillance that takes place in the United States, there are constitutional protections of U.S. citizens or U.S. residents. If you're sitting somewhere else in the world, the Constitution doesn't protect you. And so you hear a lot of quite angry commentary from the large majority of people in the rest of the world who don't enjoy those protections. Why should they be subjected to unlimited and unrestricted surveillance? But can the U.S. Constitution protect everyone equally?
Well, this is really a political question. This isn't something that I, as a former intelligence employee, should really be the person answering. But I think it is fair to make it a question of, is this really a violation of specifically constitutional rights, or is this a violation of natural human rights? Now, the United States has agreed that we have a human right to privacy, to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. Not just in the United States, but around the world, every government. We are a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which asserts the same, as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which asserts the same even more strongly. And we have international bodies, for example, that have issued reports in the wake of 2013 that have found mass surveillance is a clear violation of human rights. This isn't an edge case. This isn't something that's controversial. Now, the argument that I think they could make there, which would be, somewhat more persuasive, is not really that this is a question of, are we trying to apply constitutional rights to people who are, not United States citizens? Because for me, I look back on, we have different wording in each different, amendment to the Bill of Rights, but this is a country that was founded on the idea that all men are created equal, not all U.S. persons are created equal. And so when we think about, all right, well, what argument might work there? They would be a little more honest if they said, we have serious adversaries out there, there are scary people out there who don't play by the same restrictions, are we placing ourselves at risk by not playing by the same rules? But I would answer that that is something that we do with regularity. We don't reduce ourselves to the level of morality asserted by our enemies, applied by our enemies in their use of power, or at least we're not supposed to. We say we will not torture. Now, we know that was not the case quite recently, which is quite unfortunate, particularly given that no one was held to account for that particularly egregious violation of law and rights. But we do this in many other applications as well. I mean, when we think about how we wage war as the United States, we have rejected policies of total war. We say we regulate ourselves by the Geneva Conventions and so on and so forth. The same thing applies in any domain of society, whether it's we're talking about civil protections for individuals against law enforcement, or the restrictions that we place on our intelligence services. We don't want to be emulating security services in East Germany. We don't want to be emulating security services in modern China. We want to be emulating a standard that we believe can be defended and is actually attractive to all of the other societies around the world, so that they will emulate us. They will feel a closeness in values with us that not only gains us allies, but gains us stability and peace that's actually robust and enforceable outside of military means.
So I'm trying to picture some of your former colleagues sitting at home watching this interview and throwing tomatoes and saying, that's unbelievably naive, all this la-la world peace business. Spy agencies spy. We ask them to spy for a really good reason. We want to anticipate the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the end of the Soviet Union, or the planning of Al-Qaeda for a big attack, or a shift in alliance that's going to undermine our position in some important negotiation somewhere. We demand, in fact, we ask them, how did you fail to find this out for us in time to do something about it?
But that's
your
argument
could sound like almost a comprehensive rejection of spying. I mean, what is it? What's okay as far as you see it?
Right. It's not a comprehensive rejection of spying. In fact, this is supposed to be the official position of the United States. This is what we purport to claim. What comes out of our president, what comes out of the Congress, and what the courts say. The difference is this is application in fact as opposed to application in rhetoric. This does not mean that we don't basically monitor the movements of tanks, by military services. Again, if we're talking about intelligence services, the bar is very low. We're not saying, you have to go show specific probable cause. You're going to use this in indictment. You're going to basically seek a conviction. They are held to the standard of reasonable articulable suspicion. If you go, well, the Russian military is moving tanks to the border, that's a justification that has traditionally worked and continues to work. What I and basically everyone else in civil society is arguing against is that pre-criminal investigation, which is quite different. They're saying we want to surveil everyone all the time. I countered that when we watch everyone all the time, when we collect everything, we understand nothing. And there's actually strong evidence to believe this is the case. For example, the fact that we were monitoring the phone calls of everyone in the United States doesn't mean that we prevented the Boston bombings, despite the fact that the Russian intelligence services gave us a specific dossier on these individuals and said they had been speaking with extremists, they've been doing this, that, and the other, you might as well investigate them. Now, why was the investigation into them so cursory and poor? Ultimately, it comes down to a question of resourcing. There are finite man hours in a work week. There are finite, basically, dollars to be thrown to give the problem. And in the intelligence community, again, this was my wheelhouse. I worked with systems of mass surveillance every day in my last position. When you come in the morning, you've got a giant stack of results to go through from all your previous ongoing queries of things that you think are of interest, from all the world's internet traffic from the previous day, before you can even begin to look at the new things that come into your desk on every day from partner tips and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, does mass surveillance work? And the answer there from what we've seen from the evidence is that no, it does not. And even if it did, would it be worth the costs? Do we want to enable the majority of the country to vote away the minority's rights. That's the reason we have a constitution, is to say that even in moments of political passion, even periods of political extremes, we don't get rid of inherited values, inherited liberties that people fought and died for. And unfortunately, we have a class of officials, sort of a cohort in government today, that is arguing that things are different. This time, this time it's different, things have changed. Let's get rid of how we did things traditionally, because this might work better, despite the fact that there's no evidence to show that it is actually the case.
One of the most surprising things to me as I reported through the material that you disclosed was how much the United States was doing overseas, using different authorities that did not require a foreign intelligence surveillance court, that did not require a Patriot Act, did not require court supervision of any kind, doing this under the executive order that's governed intelligence gathering for a long time, 12333. And the story that sticks in my mind above all the others is that the US government was breaking into the private fiber links that linked these gigantic, say, Google and Yahoo data centers overseas. So they have data centers in Ireland and Singapore and Latin America, and they have to talk to each other. They actually synchronize their data, and they do load balancing and so forth. And so you had the US government breaking in there and helping itself to whatever it wanted, even though it had a legal basis for obtaining that information in the United States under the supervision of a judge. And you've now seen those same technology companies and others doing something that I don't think has ever happened before. Gigantic US companies are spending tens and perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars in efforts to thwart their own country's intelligence services, in efforts to lock themselves down. Are the market and tech forces, as you see it, a more important way of redrawing the boundaries than, say, legislation or courts?
Well, what we can say there, I think, broadly as a community, is that it's certainly faster and it's more enforceable. We can pass all the legislation in the world, but when the president authorizes an unconstitutional surveillance program, that unconstitutional surveillance program is carried out. We see that that was the case, and it still is the case today. For people in the audience who aren't technical, but sort of the breakdown of the story that you just mentioned, what he's talking about is the way that the internet stitches data centers together for large companies like Google, Yahoo, and so on and so forth is your mailbox. When you connect to your email around the world, these things get shifted. It doesn't live on your computer, it lives on the company's computer. And those mailboxes get rehomed from data center to data center based on the cost of bandwidth and so on and so forth, where the storage is available. The US NSA, and this is not, I want to be clear here, I don't criticize specifically the NSA. This is not a United States problem. This is a global problem. We have to deal with this, not just here at home, but against all of our adversaries doing the same kind of thing. And if we don't set the right standard here, now, quickly, we're going to be quickly overtaken by circumstance. The issue is that they found that they didn't like the way their authorities were restricted in gaining access to sort of these companies' rich data sets, the Googles, the Yahoos, as you mentioned. So what they did is they went where the authorities restricting them, or the restrictions were weaker, and their authorities were greater. This is a principle that I refer to as jurisdictional arbitrage. And basically, they waited until your mailbox is rehomed outside the borders of the United States, and they snatch it up there, they put it in the database with everything else, and they sift through it. Now, what happened in, this was a story that you published, which was actually, I don't need to congratulate you on it, I think you've heard it elsewhere. But the basic outcome is that the companies immediately responded to encrypt those links. When your mailbox is rehomed today, it is protected by that same layer of encryption that the government is now, for reasons that they don't like to explain, saying is really starting to bother them. It's no coincidence that the rhetoric against encryption has ramped up at the same time that adoption has increased. Those mailboxes weren't encrypted in 2013, they are encrypted today. And as you say, companies are the ones leading the charge here. The technical community are the ones who are leading the charge here. And while we don't want to basically halo companies and say, you know, they're champions of all that's good in the world, because they actually aren't the best actors in all cases here, although they do a lot of good in others. It comes down to the fact that we saw in the 2013 scandal people reacting very strongly, not because it was about surveillance, but it was because it was about democracy. It was about the fact that the facts of how our world worked were being denied to us in a very real, very personal way. And when governments do this in the dark, in secret, any government around the world, they don't only increase ire against the particular agency, the particular mechanism that was carrying out these policies, but they actually begin to undermine the legitimacy of government itself, of the social contract. People begin to feel that if we cannot rely on government to be a responsible steward for our rights, then we have to do that ourselves as a community. And that's the natural response that you're seeing from the market and everywhere else. You
talked about companies as sort of good and bad actors. A cynical way to look at this, when you say, okay, well, the companies have decided they're going to encrypt all their links so the NSA can't spy on you, that their position is that nobody gets to spy on our customers except us.
Right.
Does that help very much?
I think it actually does, because it's an improvement from where the status quo was. That's not the end of the road. We still need to continue. We still need to improve things step by step. But ultimately, it comes down to a question of intent. The problem with the 2013 status quo was that the intention of your communication between you and a service provider was being taken advantage of and subverted to the interests of completely different parties that were outside of any sort of contract, outside of any sort of relationship between sort of the customer and the two endpoints, let's put it that way. Now, at least, we have some recourse. If companies violate their agreement, you can try to enforce that in court. Researchers can discover it. You know who's responsible because only the company had access, other than the user themselves. Prior to 2013, it was a free-for-all. Everybody was going through this. And unfortunately, the people who suffered were the ordinary citizens around the world who had done nothing wrong.
I want to ask something that goes to the question of trust and motivation. You had a lot of coworkers that you knew at the CIA and at the NSA. You volunteered to be among them. You believed in the mission. Is it your sense that they believe in what they're doing, or are they deliberately trampling on rights, or do you think that they actually think they're doing the right thing to protect us, and does that matter to you?
Well, of course. I mean, nobody goes into the NSA expecting to be a mustache-twirling villain. None of them are bad guys. Again, even when I was there, where do you think I got this sort of thinking, this reasoning from? I didn't wake up one morning and I had sort of this political understanding that, sprang fully formed from the head of Zeus. This was the result of conversations that I had with colleagues at the NSA over a course of years and others in the intelligence community before that. Everyone on the inside at the working level who actually dealt with these programs was deeply unsettled and concerned by the implications of them and by the fact that it was happening outside the domain of sort of public law, outside of the fact that any sort of reasonable, reliable, open court could look at these programs. We all saw the way that the government was continuously asserting the state secrets privilege in cases where they really shouldn't. Questions about, or in cases of indefinite detention, in cases of literal torture, in cases of extrajudicial murder that impact United States citizens and things like that, prior to any trial, far outside the boundaries of any battlefield. What would you do if you were sitting there? You're not going to think, oh, let's find out how to tighten the screws on all these Americans, ha 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 ha. You're going to think about the implications. You're going to think about what you're doing, but at the same time, you're going to think about your family. You're going to think about your career. You're going to think about your future, and you're going to think about what's happened to every single person who has stood up and said something about these abuses of policy, these abuses of authority, and these abuses of law prior to the day that you're thinking about that. I mean, if you look at the case of Thomas Drake, for example, they tried to destroy this individual, put them away in jail for life for talking about classic waste, fraud, and abuse, talking about things like warrantless surveillance. And ultimately, the case collapsed and everything like that, but they still, out of spite, convicted this individual on misdemeanor charges. When I was talking to people at the office about this, I would get a lot of agreement. I would get a lot of heads nodding. I would get people who actually felt more strongly or more radically about these issues than I did. But at the same time, they said, if you say something about this, they will destroy you. And everybody knows that. It's not something that is really left to chance or question. So when you say, are people looking at this, thinking this is ridiculous, this guy's naive, throwing tomatoes, the only people who do that are people who actually haven't worked these systems themselves. They're the people who sit in the office, get sort of the agency all mass sort of emails that get sent to the entire workforce. They sit in an accounting office, an HR office somewhere, or they're sort of a political appointee or some senior official, where it is so much in their interest, not just for their career, but their sort of identity as an individual, as their tribal affiliation, that they don't want to think too deeply about these issues. They just want to brush them off. Because whether you agree with me, whether you agree with the NSA, there's really no question that these programs are controversial. There's really no question that these programs never should have been instituted in the first place, or we wouldn't have the Congress, right now, both Republicans and Democrats, coming together to say, look, we need to stop mass surveillance. If in our broken sort of, shall we say, somewhat challenged political culture of the modern time can come together and agree that, whoa, this simply went too far, anybody, any reasonable person recognizes that this is something that needs to change.
So two things. One, we started a little late, so I'm going to go a little late, and I'm about to bring this out to the floor to widen the conversation. I'm going to ask you one last, since you just opened the door to the ethics of whistleblowing, to the ethics of transgressing this quite sharp line that exists inside the intelligence community. You handed over a lot of information. You've said that you don't think all of it should have been published, or should be published, and far from all of it has been published. But why is it okay, if you think there's security risk in it, to have handed it over to journalists at all? And why would anybody want to trust the likes of me to decide what should be disclosed?
Because that's how our system works. We're modeled upon institutions of checks and balances and things like that. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that the checks and balances in our society have failed comprehensively. That's what whistleblowing is about. Whistleblowing isn't about what happens when times are good. Whistleblowing is what occurs when times are bad. When we have basically officials on the Senate Intelligence Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, who are cheerleading for surveillance agencies, as opposed to overseeing them as adversaries, as watchdogs on behalf of the public. When we have the executive who is sort of instituting programs and policies outside the color of law, on the basis of really sort of novel and most frequently secret interpretations of law that are signed only by the Office of Legal Counsel or the Department of Justice, but nobody publicly knows about it. When the only courts that are reviewing these programs are secret rubber stamp courts that, again, in 30 years say no 12 times, there's something wrong. The very first open court to review these programs said they're likely unconstitutional and they're Orwellian in their scope. But beyond that, it gets to the question of how do you blow the whistle? How do you do it in the best way? Now, some people who really aren't comfortable with what happened in 2013, who will never embrace it, who will basically say, I can't approve of that, they do so on the basis, not because they say it's wrong, not because they say someone was hurt, because again, it's not 2013, it's 2015 now, and the government itself, which has every incentive to say that this got people killed, this caused harm, has never in a single case named a single individual who has been harmed, even a hair on their head. What they're really trying to disown there, what they don't want to accept, is the possibility of risk. And whistleblowing will always entail risk. The operation of the free press will always entail risk. So when people criticize about, the scope of revelation, the fact that yes, journalists need to understand, they need to be able to access more material than will be reviewed or will be published in the final product. When people try to split hairs about what documents were read, what documents were evaluated, things like this, what they're really saying is that freedom from risk is more important to them than freedom of the press. But that's not what this country is founded on. That's not what our values say. And I'm glad, even if it was only a little bit, a small part, I'm proud of the fact that I was able to play a small role in protecting that and pushing that forward. And I would say when you think about how do you do this, you don't reject that risk exists. You don't say that it's beyond possibility that some sort of speculative harm could come from this. But you weigh the speculative harms of disclosure against the concrete harms of the policy, the damage to rights, the damage to individuals, the damage of mass surveillance to our norms, to the future of our society. And when you do this, you go beyond this. How do I mitigate the risks in how it is disclosed? And what I chose to do in my case, and this isn't to say that it works for everybody, and this isn't to say that it's the best possible model, was I tried to replicate the model of checks and balances that we have in our own government. It sort of oversees the way this is structured by not publishing anything myself. I've never put a story on the internet. I've never said, America needs to know this. I partnered with journalistic institutions that are well trusted, that everybody realizes, these people are the champions of the public and the public domain. They exist to basically work in contest with the government over what the public has a right to know. But then recognizing that even though journalists are the people in our society who are best placed to make the decisions about what is in the public interest to be known, the fact that these are secret programs, the fact that some foreseeable danger could exist if the journalists didn't understand the implications of every story, what's involved, that they contact the government in advance of publication and give the government a chance to weigh in, to justify the program, to say there is a specific risk to this specific individual that you did not see, and because of this, we ask that you request this detail. And I think I'm actually glad to say that that was the case in the reporting of these stories. I mean, you could speak to that much better than I could, I think. But if the government says, if you publish this sentence, it's going to get this individual killed, it's not particularly controversial to say, all right, we'll still move forward with the story. We will still move forward and report what's important about it to be known, but we're not going to get this guy killed. And I think that's how you mitigate risks, probably.
So I think there may be a national tomato shortage from the, but I'm not going to try to speak for every point of view here. I'm going to open it up.
Well, let me actually ask you a question before we start there.
Against advice of counsel, I will entertain a question.
Right, and the question here is, when you talk about the ethics of reporting, are you really concerned that the stories you reported are going to get people killed? Did the government make a persuasive case in any one of these meetings that said, if you run this story, people are going to die, and you believed it, but you sort of overruled it? Is that how the Post works, or how did you go through that process?
It's a longer answer, but I'll give it a quick shot. First of all, I think known individuals with high probability are going to die is too high a standard. I don't think they need to make that case in order to make the case that there will be genuine harm to security. So even in the very first...
Just was purpose of illustration.
Yes, right. Okay, so even in the very first story I wrote, which was about PRISM, the collection of content from big internet companies under Section 702 of the blah, 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 we reproduced some slides from an NSA briefing, and we did some reporting behind it and around it and wrote the story. There were some things that the government didn't even have to ask me not to publish. I started the conversation by saying, there are things on these slides that refer to very specific operations against targets that, almost anyone would say are legitimate targets of U.S. intelligence, that if we publish them, that will be the end of that collection. There was no reason to publish that. Well, I was interested in writing about the boundaries and the policies and not blowing specific operations. So I told them, I'm not going to publish that. They said, well, please also don't publish the names of the companies. And I said, why? What's the harm? And they said, their principal argument was that it would make the companies less willing to cooperate in the future. And I said that's actually a reason, that's the reason why we do publish. Not that we want to stop the program, but that if the harm consists of the people won't like what you're doing and will object, and you or the companies are going to be less willing to do it. That's the purpose of reporting for accountability reasons.
So you raised a point there that I actually want to follow up on, which is that you talked about how you could go through one slide and see things in there that you didn't want to report on, that you thought were sort of outside there. And I think it's not necessarily that these aren't newsworthy or that they're not material in some way or another. It's that you said, you know, the national security implications, at least for that story, meant that they wouldn't be reviewed. But this makes me think a number of different stories have been run by different organizations, by different institutions. Were there any stories there that you thought were great stories that were really material to the debate, to the conversation, but they were overlooked, that they haven't gotten enough attention?
Well, look, I mean, I'm sure I overlooked things. I would have loved
but I mean,
what
actually been published, stories that are out there that the public missed, the debate missed, the response.
I think the administration and Congress have done a very good job of trying to cabin the debate, of confining it to Section 215 phone records collection, or maybe a little bit about the collection from the internet companies, and they have simply refused to engage over and over again on the question of foreign collection, of collection overseas under purely executive authority, which affects foreign targets, but also lots of Americans, because Americans happen to travel and make phone calls when they're overseas, or their data is in a foreign data center and so on. And they have simply refused to engage on that. I'm actually happy to see that the President's Civil Liberties Oversight, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board has just decided to take that question on and look deeply into it. I think that'll be a big addition to the debate. So I'm about to move to questions here. I would urge students to raise their hands. It's a university. We'd like to have students first, and we have quite a few experts in the room. Wait for the mic. We've got mic runners. Raise your hands, mic runners. So I have a student down here. Let's start with you.
All right. So, Mr. Snowden.
Sorry, please say who you are, and do please keep it brief so we can get more of them.
Absolutely. So my name is Matthew Romer. I'm a freshman here. You've talked mostly today about metadata collection, and I would be curious as to, you know, at the NSA, how much of the privacy violations did you see due to metadata collection? And how much did you see due to collection of specific data, people passing around photos, reading message logs? In the overall conversation, do you think metadata is more important, or do you think these kind of more specific violations are a bigger violation of privacy?
So this is a really important question. Thank you for asking. It requires a lot of nuance to answer comprehensively, but really it comes down to two things. The most common violations, and I think the biggest implications of mass surveillance, are really about metadata, not content. However, conversely, the news interest is greatest, and the controversy is always greatest when the problem has a face, when it's about the content, when it's about somebody being caught on camera, being exposed in, say, sexual or very private ways, their reputation's been ruined. When it's personalized, it's very easy to tell that story. But when we think about metadata and the fact how it's used at the NSA, metadata really is more important than content, and it's actually much more sensitive than content. And this is because it can be evaluated algorithmically. You can handle it much easier than you can with content. It's easier to parse, it's easier to weigh, it's easier to transport, it's easier to deliver. And in aggregate, metadata is actually a proxy for content. Metadata is very much like what a private eye derives when they follow somebody around. They're not going to be close enough to you when they're sitting behind you in a cafe to get every word that you say in a whispered conversation. But they're going to know where you were, they're going to know who you met with, they're going to know when you did it, they're going to know how you left, they're going to know where you went. And when you get this in aggregate, you tell the full story of someone's life. I don't need to rehash the specific examples, because I think everybody can imagine where a pattern of phone calls could reveal personal problems, particularly when you know who both parties on the end of the calls are. But when you think about metadata generally, and and what it means to the NSA, it's great that I don't have to make this argument anymore. The director of national security, former Michael Hayden, said we kill people based on metadata. Actually, that was Stuart Baker, the general counsel of the, no, I take that back. Stuart Baker, he was the one who said metadata actually tells you everything about somebody's life.
That's on
screen now. If you have enough metadata, you don't really need content. Hayden followed up and actually pushed him further on that and said, we kill people based on metadata. And this is true. Metadata is how we target drone strikes.
All right, let's move to Liza, please.
Hi there, Liza Goitein from the Brennan Center for Justice. First of all, thank you very much for what you did and the sacrifice that you made and for keeping me very busy for the last 2 years. I wanted to ask you, a lot of what we hear when we try to advocate for surveillance reform is that there has been no evidence of abuse. And by abuse, I mean, a lot of us think that merely collecting all this data is abuse, but they're talking about J. Edgar Hoover style FBI type abuses, where the information is actually used to harass, political enemies or, social justice movements, that kind of thing. And, what we've heard is if there were such abuse happening, that would have showed up in the documents that Snowden made available. And, we've kind of speculated, well, maybe that kind of thing isn't documented in the databases that, he had access to or whatever. But I'd be interested to hear your response to the argument, well, we haven't seen any evidence of abuse.
Right. Thank you again. This is another good one. There's actually robust evidence for abuse at basically all levels, even if you believe the NSA's interpretation of its own rules, its own laws, their own documents, which actually Bart reported this one as well, showed that they break privacy laws thousands and thousands of times per year. And each one of those individual 1,000 times doesn't refer to an individual case, an individual event. It actually refers, in many cases, to a cluster of events. One of those thousands of events, I believe it was 2,776 times in a single year, represented collecting all of the phone calls in a Washington, D.C. area code, and this is content as well, I believe, for a period of days. So, we're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of privacy violations there. But when we talk about personalizing and the abuse there, when we talk about the most egregious cases, yes, as you say, it's not really documented the same way. They're not going to say, hey, we're looking to ruin this person's life because we don't like them. It's always going to be justified in bureaucratic terms that sound pretty good. I mean, that's what the job of these people are. And primarily, that's going to be driven by the FBI as opposed to the NSA when we're talking about domestic use. The NSA collects it, even under, for example, the Section 215 authority we talked about earlier, despite the fact that NSA is not named in the statute. The FBI is the authority that's specifically empowered to do that surveillance. They lack the capability. So contrary to what the statute's language says, the NSA did it. But beyond that, we do have even specific individualized, personalized cases of abuse. There's a news outlet called The Intercept, where Glenn Greenwald ran a story, I believe, that showed US professors, Americans, things like that. These are upstanding citizens. We're being monitored under these terrorism authorities by the NSA, being shared with the FBI. The FBI is authorizing it and so on and so forth, overseeing these things. Because of their political views, because of their political affiliations, because of their political associations. There are also stories that have been reported, I believe, in Huffington Post late 2013, that showed the NSA was using information that collected through mass surveillance authorities regarding individuals' pornography viewing habits that they were planning to use to discredit political extremists because they thought they were radicalizers. They thought they were basically getting people involved in jihad and things like this, despite the fact that the report admitted these individuals did not have any direct association to violence or terrorism. So really the question becomes, what is your bar for abuse? When the NSA says it breaks the law thousands of times a year, and you say, oh, well, that's not really abuse. You see US professors being spied on through surveillance authorities, despite the fact that they've never been charged with any crime despite years of this monitoring, continuous years of this monitoring. And you say, oh, but that's not abuse. And the fact that people are being, their private sexual habits are being, plans are being made to expose them, to discredit them on behalf of their political views, as terrible and as much as we disagree with them as they are, is that abuse? Where do you draw the line about this? And even if this is a thing where you go, all right, that's not abuse, is that a decision that should be made by the National Security Agency? Is that a decision that should be made by a few members in Congress who get more campaign contributions than any other members of Congress, called the Gang of Eight from defense contractors? Or should that be made by the full body? Should that be made by open courts? Should that be made by the public broadly? I would assert, I would argue that it's us who should fundamentally make that decision, not, these insulated and sheltered officials.
I think I should just say for the record that as someone who sometimes gets to call himself visiting professor, that I don't actually agree with the way that story characterized the surveillance of those professors and others. This was a list of people, or actually a list of email addresses who you could eventually associate with people in the documents that showed that that they were being surveilled subject to a FISA warrant, meaning that a court, although a secret court, had said there was probable cause to believe
not probable cause, reasonable articulable suspicion, lower standard.
Yeah, I have to go back and check. There's two.
Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Okay, but either way, the court said there's good reason to look at these guys. We don't know what the predicate was. A person can be a professor and also a something else, and every now and then we've found that to be true. And we also don't know what they got from the surveillance. So I looked at that story hard. I considered running it myself, and I decided I didn't have enough evidence that the motive was political, or that the people who were targeted, that there were no grounds for the targeting.
So I do understand and sympathize with the sort of argumentation there, because we do want strong evidence when we make these stories. At the same time, when the government is not forthcoming, when the government aggressively asserts state secrets privilege, when these things are brought before court, when they argue that you don't even have standing to challenge these policies because you cannot prove you have been spied on, and the only sort of court that is actually saying, all right, maybe you should take a look at these guys, is the same court that, again, in 35 years says no 12 times. That's not a real court. That's not real oversight. And that's not a real check on the power and reach of these agencies.
Okay, so I'm going to take the next question. I didn't mean to distract. There's a question right over here. If we can get a microphone up there. Here it comes. Just wait for the mic, please.
Hi, my name is Paula Kift. I'm an alumna here and current PhD student at NYU studying the right to privacy from a transatlantic perspective. And you mentioned that most encryption programs do not extend their protection to the protection of metadata, which can easily be accessed by the US government, and increasingly also by governments around the world, democratic governments such as the government of my home country, Germany, which was also offended by the revelations, but is now debating introducing a data retention law at home as well. So I was wondering whether you see any solutions on the horizon, either technological or legal, to address this fundamental vulnerability.
So this is a real challenge, and I would actually say it's a research challenge, but I'm not a PhD, so I'm probably not the best person to speak to that. The challenge basically is we can encrypt the content of the communication, but it's very difficult to disguise the fact that the communication occurred. In the intelligence community, we refer to these separate events as the fact of a communication and the content of the communication. And there are ways to basically protect and try to mitigate that fact of signaling information that crosses at least internet-based communications through things like mixed routing networks, mixed nets like Tor. But there's a big efficiency cost associated with basically taking a lot of communications, buffering them for a period of time, and mixing them up with other people's to try to play a little bit of a shell game and make it harder to monitor them from end to end. This is something that hopefully people will be investing a lot of research effort into seeing if there's a better solution, but it is a hard problem and I don't believe it's solved right now. I would say it is a central problem to resolve, as you say, particularly given the fact that the desire to access this data is only increasing over time.
All right. Please, down here, just one moment. We've got our mics at the top of the stairs. Center, front row.
Hi, my name is Jeanette Beebe, class of 2014. I'm wondering, as a young journalist, how you would suggest we cover your story. I know that you've recently spoken with John Oliver, you've done a variety of different things, and what your advice might be going forward.
My advice would be disassociate it from me, because I'm not really the issue. The media, as we said earlier, they're really in love with personalities, personal stories. They want to have a face to put with anything to really get people into it. But culturally, I'm not sure that's a norm that we should embrace. Everybody will say, of course, that's the status quo, that's just the way things are. But does it have to be? Is it possible that we can actually get people interested in the reality of the world, the actual impact of the policies, and the real points of contention, and talk about this in a reasoned way? Or do we have to talk about, basically the talking heads, the pundits, the conflicts beyond personalities? I would hope that we don't have to, but again, that's a challenge that's going to have to be borne by journalists.
There's a student here, blue shirt. We're also a really young faculty member.
My name is Jacob Edelman. I'm actually a junior in high school right now. I've experienced technology improving and augmenting my education. My grades are now online. I'm provided with an email account by my school. I use a computer in school on a daily basis. Even private information pertaining to students' health in my school is put online by a contracted third party. The security involved with any of these things is flimsy, if it really existent at all. With all this data pertaining to myself, my friends, and my siblings online, if some years in the future one of my classmates or I attract the suspicion of the NSA, or even brought to trial on something entirely unrelated, is it possible that this data from our school could come back to haunt us?
The question really answers itself, I think. But, this is something where I have to say, I don't like to think that the NSA is going to be dangling people's history over them domestically for political purposes. Although these kind of things have happened in the past and they are likely to happen again. It's just something I don't like to confront, because I know the people there, that's not their intention. Basically, everybody in the intelligence community, all of the spies, as they were, they know they break the law. They don't really care about the law. We get trained on the law. We understand it because we need to justify things. We need to keep in the line, within the lines. But people basically there have a culture, a mindset that they do bad things for the right reasons. Now, the danger is, in your case, they think that doing bad things to you is the right thing to do in that. That, I think, is very far off, particularly even in terms of capability. One of the real challenges is how do we memorialize all of this information about not just you, but everybody increasing periods of time as more and more data is being created every day. This is why metadata is so attractive. It's tiny, it's compressible, it's text only. It's not rich data, it's not audio streams, it's not YouTube video files of cats. It's very tiny things that can be kept basically forever. And there's a reason that we're building massive data centers in Utah and things like this. They're not building that just for looks. The question is, how do we control it? How do we prevent that from happening? Not as what your question posits. What if they do this? How do we institute protections to reassure ourselves, to build a culture where we know that will not be the case, because it is not to their benefit. It is not to the benefit of our society, and it's not to the benefit of any political partisans. We want to make sure that assertions of authority, no matter how they're being used, no matter how data is being collected, is restricted to basically only being used when it is necessary and proportional to the threat faced. And today, I think we're actually quite fortunate that we face no existential threats. There's a lot of alarmism that comes from terrorism officials or people talking about proliferation. And threats haven't disappeared, they haven't gone away, they haven't evaporated. But if you look at any statistics, any metrics, the world is safer today than it ever has been before. We live richer, more peaceful, longer lives than any generation before us. And I think it's our job, the job of everybody within a free society, within a liberal society, to make sure that they're also liberal and free lives. And that's what I hope that you and your generation will do a lot to help, because we're going to need it.
So we've got, before we do another one here, we've got a Twitter question that Kim Shepley will
I'm
read.
channeling Twitter questions. This is one from Rickard, Colorado. I'm not sure if he's in the audience. What's your take on Secure Drop and the other systems for confidentially communicating with journalists and others?
Why don't you just briefly explain what that is?
Okay. So Secure Drop is a software system designed to allow whistleblowers in really threatened context. You know, we're not talking about somebody working at Walmart. We're talking about somebody working for a national security center, some big adversary banks with a lot of money, you know, giant corporations, pharmaceutical companies, things like that, who have a really rational fear of significant retaliation. How do you create a system, a means, a mechanism for them to be able to communicate anonymously with journalists in a manner that's protected and sort of makes it very difficult for them to be retaliated against? How do you protect journalist sources? Secure Drop is a system to use that Tor mixed net routing system that I discussed earlier. In addition, you layer it with some traditional encryption programs like GPG to make sure that even if somebody intercepts the communication, they can't get the content of it. Even if they get the metadata, it's not going to point to you because you don't use this system from your home. You use it from a coffee shop somewhere, an open wireless access point, things like that. So the trail doesn't go back to you. It's pretty good. I don't think it's at a point yet where anyone should trust their life to it. It's still in beta, I believe. And all of these systems, you never want to trust that any one wall will protect you. You need to follow a principle of defense in depth, where you layer protections, where if Secure Drop fails, if GPG fails, you know, if somehow you made a mistake and you paid for your coffee at the coffee shop with your credit card in your true name, that you've got some other measures there so that instead of one thing going wrong, things have to fail comprehensively. I did similar things in my case, and they did work, so it's not impossible. And
I'll add just one word for someone with something important to say who is not technical. The purpose of Secure Drop was to make it very hard to make mistakes, to be able to communicate with genuine anonymity and genuine confidentiality about what you're saying with a journalist. I happen to run an instance of Secure Drop myself, which you can find in my Twitter profile, at Bart Gellman. And if you've got something important to tell me, I'd like to hear it.
I do believe we have some national security folks in the audience, right, speaking later. You know, maybe if the NCTC chief has some misgivings, he can reach out.
Yeah, he's going to have his shot at me in the afternoon. Someone up there near the top there, please, with a Princeton crest.
Thank you. I'm Anastasia Repullo. I'm a student here. And I wanted to ask you, do you think it would be more legitimate, like less of a violation of civil rights, or even practically feasible for the government to gather all of the information that they do now, but like not go through it, not actually monitor it, unless they have evidence or suspicion sufficient to merit a warrant?
Right, to make it clear, in most cases, that's exactly what the government says it does. It ingests all this information, but it promises not to look unless it's got a really good reason.
Right. The government draws a distinction between mass surveillance and bulk collection, which are really, in mechanism, the same thing. By saying the difference is mass surveillance is where you collect everything and then you immediately read it. You know, you've got to have people with headphones listening to every phone call in the country for it to qualify as mass surveillance for them. Bulk collection is where you ingest it all. You bring it into your systems, basically. They steal everyone's private records. They put it in basically the database, and then they say, oh, but we promise we won't use this unless it's really important. And there is an argument to be made there that it's somewhat different. But in this country, we don't need to make that argument because we have the Fourth Amendment. It forbids not just unreasonable search, where they look at the information, but also unreasonable seizure in the first place. The violation in American terms, in concrete terms, is the fact that they intercept private records without an individualized suspicion of wrongdoing in the first place. Basically, preemptive monitoring. That's the violation there. But they do, you have to say, avoid a double violation there, in that they're not also searching it at the same time. If a US government official ever denies something on the basis of we don't collect that, collection means something different to them. It doesn't mean what it means in the dictionary. It doesn't mean intercepting a record or putting it in the database. It means pulling it out of the database and looking at it, reviewing it. That's collection to them, tasked collection. But I hope that answers the distinction.
On the aisle over there.
Hi, I'm Joshua Kroll. I'm a graduate student in the Center for Information Technology Policy. I wanted to ask a question following up on the question earlier about bulk collection in the international context, which is, what is the right mechanism for reform of bulk collection on the international level? I mean, how do you prevent the situation where different countries are bulk collecting information on people outside of their own borders and then sharing it with each other, maybe not because they're allies, but because they're at least friendly? And some of these countries do not subscribe to the higher ideals you proposed that we espouse for bulk collection program, limiting bulk collection of foreigners in the context of our own intelligence services. So how do you limit that when people who don't espouse those values internationally have the same, are collecting the same information?
Thank you for asking. That's really sort of a policy question of, all right, we can set the standard, we can set the law, but how do we enforce it, particularly when we've got information sharing, when that information can be shared out to additional degrees, and how do we just make sure that other people aren't doing the thing that we've just sworn off? The answer there, at least in the content context, is end-to-end encryption. The way mass surveillance happens is as your communications transit the internet across the lines, the fiber optic cables under the sea or the satellites in the air, basically they are collected, they're ingested at the telecommunications companies or third-party taps somewhere that have been dug into the ground or in place on a cable or something like that, that basically allow them to just get everything as it crosses the line. How you prevent that from happening is you encrypt the information so if they capture it, it has no meaning to them, particularly if we can get to the point where we can begin to disassociate that fact of and that content of through things like mixed routing networks. So you don't necessarily know that this came from this point to that point. It's a little more opaque there. But the counterpoint here is, all right, if we prevent bulk collection, not just here, but in all of these other countries, how do we make sure that they can still meet their legitimate investigative needs, as Bart put forth earlier? And that's that you attack the endpoints, right? Every communication has a beginning point and an end point where it goes back and forth. Mass surveillance happens in transit as it crosses that. Surveillance forces them to go on an individualized basis where they go to the ends of those communications, or they serve a warrant to the actual service providers who may have their own databases there. That would be how you enforce it through a policy standpoint.
Up front here, please.
Sorry, just to clarify that if it wasn't clear, you basically mandate strong, reliable encryption in transit.
Right.
Hi, I'm a current student. I'm a sophomore at Princeton, and I wanted to ask you, we heard a lot about how the government should change its policy, but is there anything citizens can do right now, or if so, and what suggestions do you have for individuals?
One of the key things would be to defend your right to encryption, defend your right to privacy. One of the arguments that is often made, it's not really well thought out, but it sounds good. It's a little bit truthy, so people sort of, they repeat it, is if you have nothing to hide, why do you care? If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But that's basically the equivalent of saying, why do you care about why do you care about freedom of speech if you have nothing to say? If you're not really going out there and standing up and speaking out, freedom of speech isn't really that big a deal. And I'm not on TV. I don't care that much. Or I'm not a dissident. I don't say anything that upsets people. You have to be able to stand up and assert these values and say that, look, I'm not going to say, I need a right to privacy, or I don't need a right to privacy because I don't have anything to hide. The same way that I'm going to say, well, we don't need freedom of speech because I don't have anything to say. What you've got to do is recognize that rights, aren't really granted by governments. These are things that are inherent to you in your nature. If the government wants to intrude on your rights, you don't have to justify why you need it. You make it incumbent on them to justify their intrusion into your rights. So that would be the political context there. Organize there, create a culture there and promote that. Help people understand why that matters. And the fact that this really isn't about whether or not you have something to hide. If they're collecting data about everybody in advance of any criminal suspicion of anything wrong, what they're creating are what academics have referred to as databases of ruin. Once it reaches a certain point of richness, and you put a counterterrorism analyst at it, if they look all day at communications and they say this person's a terrorist, this person's a terrorist, this person's a terrorist, we're pattern recognizing machines. It's sort of the Cardinal Richelieu thing. You put a CT analyst on a rich enough data set, and the Pope is going to look an awful lot like a terrorist. If you give me 6 lines written by the hand of the most honest man, I'll find something within which to hang him. On the more practical level, the immediate level, encrypt your communications, support services that not only encrypt your communications, and by this, I don't mean simply encrypted in transit and things like that. I mean, use a zero knowledge model. For example, Dropbox encrypts your stuff, but they have a key to it. SpiderOak, which is a competitor of them, they don't have the ability to provide your information. They don't have an ability to spy on you. So of course, they can't work contrary to your interests. Align yourselves with basically industries, with companies that will take a moral position of aligning themselves with their customers as opposed to aligning themselves against them.
Ed, I've got to end it there. There are so many more questions. Thank you very much for coming to us from Moscow.
Thank you.